hook that grabs you. New York City subway. Late evening. The air is thick with the scent of damp metal, worn-out seats, and cheap coffee in paper cups. The fluorescent lights flicker as the train glides through the underground tunnels. The rhythmic screech of the wheels against the tracks echoes through the car, blending with the distant sound of a saxophone playing somewhere in the station they just left. Commuters, weary from the day, sit in silence, each lost in their own world. A woman in a faded trench coat scrolls mindlessly through her phone, the blue light reflecting off her tired eyes. A construction worker leans against the pole, his head bobbing slightly as he fights off sleep. An elderly man clutches a folded newspaper, scanning the headlines with faint disapproval. Among them, unnoticed in a dark coat and baseball cap, sits a man recognized across the globe, Keanu Reeves. A Hollywood legend, known for his humility and quiet demeanor. He doesn't do flashy cars or private drivers. He prefers the subway, the rhythm of the city's heartbeat. Tonight, he's just another passenger, blending into the sea of strangers. The hum of the train, the occasional rustling of coats, the faint murmur of a distant conversation. Just another ordinary ride through the underbelly of the city. But within moments, something will shatter the stillness, leaving every person in this car holding their breath. As the train slows and the subway doors slide open, two NYPD officers step in, their eyes immediately locking onto a young black kid sitting near the end of the car. Maybe 18, 19 years old, headphones in, backpack slung over one shoulder. His sneaker taps absently against the floor as he stares out the window, lost in thought. One of the cops moves quickly, reaching out and gripping the kid's wrist hard. "Running from us, huh?" The cop mutters, tightening his grip. The air in the car shifts. A ripple of tension spreads, subtle but undeniable. Passengers shift in their seats, some glancing up briefly before looking away, as if pretending not to notice. Others press themselves deeper into their corners, hoping to disappear into the background. This is New York, where people keep their heads down and mind their business. But not tonight, because Keanu Reeves just stood up. His movement is slow, deliberate, not aggressive, not loud, just enough to break the unspoken rule of silence. The kid blinks, confusion flickering across his face as he pulls one earbud out. He mumbles something, but the cops aren't listening. One of them jerks him up from his seat, yanking his backpack off his shoulder. The kid stumbles slightly, caught off guard. A woman gasps quietly. Someone else reaches into their pocket, pulling out a phone. A red recording light blinks to life. Keanu steps forward. Not hurried, not hesitant, just steady. "Excuse me, officers," he says, voice calm but firm. "What's going on here?" The officers turn, scanning the man who dared to question them. At first, they don't recognize him. Just another bold New Yorker, sticking his nose where it doesn't belong. But then, murmurs spread like wildfire through the subway car. "That's Keanu F. ****ing Reeves." A teenager whispers at first, eyes wide as he nudges his friend. A woman with earbuds and pulls one out, her brows lifting. The construction worker, who moments ago was nodding off, suddenly seems wide awake. The cops hesitate. One of them tightens his jaw. He doesn't like being questioned. "This isn't your concern, sir," one officer snaps, his grip on the kid still firm. Keanu doesn't flinch. He offers a small, slow nod, his hands still in his pockets. His posture is relaxed, yet commanding. "Got it," he says. Just seems like the kid wasn't doing anything. He wasn't resisting. The young man, still caught in the officer's grip, finally finds his voice. "I didn't do anything," he says quickly. "I was just listening to music. I didn't even hear them at first." Keanu's eyes flick to the kid's hands, empty. No weapon, no stolen goods, no sign of a struggle. Just a teenager caught up in something bigger than him. "Did you check his ID?" Keanu asks, voice still level. One cop shifts uncomfortably. "We got a call." "You got a call, or you just assumed?" Keanu interrupts, his gaze steady, unblinking. A tense silence settles over the car. The recording phone stays steady, its lens unyielding. More people are watching now. The air is thick with something unspoken, something electric. A voice pipes up from the far end of the car. A man in a hoodie, sitting near the door. He was just sitting there, man. Didn't do a damn thing. A woman speaks next. Yeah, he'll trippin'. The kid's clean. The officers shift again, clearly aware of the weight pressing down on them. The unspoken rules of the subway no longer apply. People aren't looking away. They're watching, waiting. The moment stretches, taut as a wire. Finally, one of the cops exhales sharply. He lets go of the kid's wrist with a jerk, shoving the backpack back at him. All right, whatever, he mutters. Keep your nose clean, kid. The tension snaps. The cops step out at the next station, the doors hissing shut behind them. For a moment, silence lingers. Then movement resumes. The construction worker leans back. The woman in the trench coat lifts her phone again. The elderly man folds his newspaper with a quiet rustle. The kid swallows, shoulders still tense. He looks at Keanu, his expression unreadable. Yo, thanks, man, he says after a moment. I didn't think anyone would say anything. Keanu just smiles. Sometimes you gotta speak when others stay quiet. The subway car jolts forward. Conversations start up again, hushed but present. The air still hums with residual energy, like the last echoes of a thunderstorm. At the next stop, Keanu gets up, stepping onto the platform without a word. The doors close behind him, sealing him off into the night. And somewhere deep in the heart of the city, a kid who almost got swallowed by the system just learned that sometimes, even in the darkest corners, there are still people willing to stand up for what's right. The tension builds. The kid looks confused, blinking as he pulls one earbud out. He mumbles something, but the cops aren't listening. Their grip tightens. His backpack slips off his shoulder and falls to the floor with a dull thud. The subway car feels smaller now, the air heavier. Someone in the corner discreetly raises their phone, the recording light blinking to life. Keanu steps forward, not aggressive, not confrontational, just steady. "Excuse me, officers," he says, his voice carrying an odd kind of authority. Not loud, but firm. "What's going on here?" The officers turn, scanning the man who dared to question them. One of them, the younger of the two, narrows his eyes, trying to place the familiar face. The other, older and heavier, shifts his weight slightly, his grip on the kid still firm. Whispers spread through the subway car like wildfire. "That's Keanu F. ****ing Reeves." The younger officer hesitates, recognition flickering in his eyes. He's seen this guy before. But where? A movie? An interview? The hesitation is brief, but it's enough for Keanu to push forward. "This isn't your concern, sir," the older officer snaps. His hand remains clamped on the boy's arm. Keanu gives a slow nod. "Got it," he says. His voice stays level, but there's something unreadable in his expression. Just seems like the kid wasn't doing anything wrong. He wasn't resisting. The young man, still caught in the officer's grip, finally finds his voice. "I didn't do anything," he says quickly. His voice is shaking slightly. "I was just listening to music. I didn't even hear them at first." Keanu's gaze flickers downward, taking in the kid's hands, empty. No weapon. No stolen goods. Just a teenager caught up in something bigger than him. "Did you check his ID?" Keanu asks, tilting his head slightly. The question lands heavy in the already tense air. One cop shifts uncomfortably. "We got a call." "You got a call, or you just assumed?" Keanu interrupts, his voice quiet but razor sharp. The subway car, which had been filled with silent, uneasy bystanders, is now filled with something else: watchfulness. The unspoken rule of minding your own business has been broken. More eyes are on the officers now. The quiet hum of the train on the tracks suddenly feels louder. A voice pipes up from the far end of the car. A man in a hoodie, sitting near the door. He was just sitting there, man. Didn't do a damn thing. A woman joins in. "Yeah, I saw it. Y'all grabbed him out of nowhere." A third voice from the back. "What's his crime? Wearing headphones?" The officers shift again. The weight of the moment presses in, heavy and suffocating. The kid, Jordan, finally pulls his other earbud out. His eyes dart between Keanu and the officers, his breath coming a little quicker than before. The older cop clears his throat. We had a description that matched. Keanu raises an eyebrow. A description? You mean a vague idea that justified grabbing the first black teenager you saw? A murmur runs through the car. Someone else is filming now, too. A second phone raised. The younger cop glances at his partner, clearly uncomfortable. Keanu's expression remains calm. You check his ID? The older officer tightens his grip, then exhales sharply. The moment stretches unbearably long. Then, finally, the officer lets go. Jordan stumbles slightly, rubbing his wrist as he steps back. Keep your nose clean, kid, the officer mutters, shoving the backpack toward him. Keanu doesn't move. His hands remain in his coat pockets, his gaze steady. The younger officer glances at Keanu again, then at the recording phones. The older officer shoots him a glare before turning sharply and stepping toward the subway doors as the train pulls into the next station. The younger cop hesitates a second longer, then follows. The doors slide open. The officers step onto the platform without another word. The doors close behind them. For a moment, there's silence. Then, slowly, the subway car exhales. Someone mutters, "Damn." A woman shakes her head. A few people exchange glances, processing what just happened. Others go back to their phones, pretending normalcy has returned. The moment lingers in the air, heavy, but then it begins to dissolve, as all subway moments do. Jordan looks at Keanu, still rubbing his wrist. Yo, thanks, man, he says after a moment. I didn't think anyone would say anything. Keanu just offers a small smile. Sometimes you gotta speak when others stay quiet. Jordan swallows, nodding. He doesn't put his earbuds back in. Instead, he just sits there, staring out the window as the subway rolls forward, the city lights flickering by. Keanu doesn't say anything else. He just shifts slightly, glancing around the car. The moment is over, but its weight remains. A construction worker sitting near the door lets out a low whistle. Shit, he mutters under his breath. That was some real movie-type shit. A teenager sitting across from Keanu grins, shaking his head in disbelief. Man, you really John Wick in real life. Keanu chuckles softly, but says nothing. At the next stop, the train slows. Keanu gets up, nods once to Jordan, and steps off into the city, disappearing into the night. Jordan watches him go, his mind racing. He glances around at the other passengers, who are still buzzing quietly about what happened. For the first time in a long time, he feels something he hadn't felt before. Seemed that a heavy silence lingered in the subway car as the officers stepped away, their exit punctuated by the mechanical hiss of the doors closing behind them. The fluorescent lights flickered briefly, and the hum of the train resumed as it pulled away from the station. But the energy had changed. Something unspoken had just shifted in that small, enclosed space. For a moment, Jordan stood frozen, clutching the straps of his backpack as though trying to ground himself in reality. He could still feel the pressure on his wrist from where the officer had grabbed him, the weight of the stairs pressing into his skin, the feeling of being so small, so insignificant in the face of authority. He looked around, his gaze darting across the subway car. Some passengers looked away, pretending to be absorbed in their phones, while others still whispered amongst themselves. A few of them had filmed everything. The videos were probably already being uploaded, shared, passed around the digital world. Then his eyes landed on Keanu. Jordan hesitated. What do you say to someone who just stepped in for you? Who, with nothing to gain, decided to intervene? Yo, thanks, man, Jordan said, his voice quieter than he intended. I didn't think anyone would say anything. Keanu nodded, his expression calm. Sometimes you gotta speak when others stay quiet. The words hit Jordan harder than he expected. He glanced down at his shoes, replaying everything in his head. The cops, the accusations, the fear that had bubbled up so quickly inside of him. He had spent so much time believing that moments like these were inevitable, that they happened and passed like bad weather. You endure them, you move on. But Keanu had done something different. Jordan let out a slow breath, shifting his weight. They just grabbed me, he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Like I was nothing. Keanu tilted his head slightly, watching Jordan carefully. You're not nothing. The words settled in Jordan's chest. He blinked a few times, unsure of how to respond. Before he could figure it out, the train slowed again, pulling into another station. The doors slid open, and the usual shuffle of passengers took place. Some people stepped out, others stepped in. The world, indifferent to what had just happened, kept moving forward. Keanu glanced toward the door, but didn't move just yet. He turned back to Jordan. "Where are you headed?" Jordan blinked. Just home." Keanu nodded. "Mind if I ride a few more stops?" Jordan didn't know what to say, so he just shrugged. "I guess." And just like that, Keanu sat back down, as though this was just another regular commute. Underscore 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 underscore. The train moved forward again, the city lights flashing in and out of view through the windows. The subway car had settled into a more normal rhythm, but Jordan's mind was anything but settled. He kept replaying the moment in his head, the grip on his arm, the tension in the officers' voices, the way Keanu had stepped in so naturally, as if it wasn't even a question of whether or not he should. "Do you always do stuff like that?" Jordan asked suddenly. Keanu looked at him, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "What do you mean?" Just stepping in like that. Calling people out." Keanu exhaled through his nose, thoughtful. "I don't think about it that way. I just try to do the right thing when I can." Jordan frowned slightly. "A lot of people don't." Keanu nodded. "Yeah, but sometimes all it takes is one person standing up. Makes it easier for others to do the same." Jordan sat with that for a moment. He had never really thought about it like that. He had always felt small in these situations, like one person alone couldn't change anything. But Keanu had been one person, and that had been enough to make a difference. The train slowed again, another stop passing by. Keanu glanced at the station name, then back at Jordan. "This your stop?" Jordan shook his head. "Not, I got a few more." Keanu leaned back slightly. "Good?" Jordan frowned, confused. "Why good?" Keanu's smile was small but genuine. "Because I think you have something to say, and I think you're just now realizing it." Jordan blinked. He wanted to argue, to say that he didn't have anything to say at all. But something about Keanu's words stuck with him. Something about them felt true. The train continued forward, carrying them deeper into the city. And for the first time in a long time, Jordan didn't just feel like a passenger passing through. He felt like someone who could stand up too. The subway car jolted forward, and yet, something in the air had changed. Conversations slowly resumed, hushed at first, then gaining volume. People exchanged glances, their eyes reflecting a mix of disbelief and admiration. A moment ago, they had been silent spectators. Now, they had witnessed something remarkable, an intervention that disrupted the script of an everyday injustice. Jordan still sat there, his backpack now resting on his lap, his fingers gripping the straps as if he needed to reassure himself that he was still here. The adrenaline that had flooded his veins moments ago was ebbing away, leaving behind a strange emptiness. He could still feel the ghost of the officer's grip on his wrist, a reminder of how quickly things could have escalated. A few seats away, Keanu sat with the same unassuming presence he had before. He didn't revel in what had happened. He wasn't looking for acknowledgement or applause. He was simply there. Jordan exhaled, a deep, shaky breath. His gaze found Keanu's again. "Why'd you do that?" he asked, his voice quieter than he intended. Keanu tilted his head slightly, considering the question. "Because it was the right thing to do." Jordan swallowed. He had heard people say things like that before, but rarely had he seen someone live it in real time. Most people wouldn't, he admitted. Most people just look the other way. Keanu nodded. Fear does that to people. Makes them think silence is the safer choice. Jordan sat with that for a moment, rolling the words around in his mind. Feared that he had felt it too, in those moments when he realized the officers weren't listening, when he had seen the way they looked at him, not as a person, but as a problem. A woman across from them suddenly cleared her throat. That was really something back there, she said. She looked at Jordan. "You okay, kid?" Jordan hesitated, then gave a small nod. "Yeah, I think so." Another voice piped up. "That was messed up. They just grabbed him out of nowhere." "They do it all the time," someone else added, a man in a business suit who had been watching everything unfold from the corner, but not usually with a guy like him standing in the way. He nodded toward Keanu. Keanu only smiled faintly. Just happened to be in the right place. Or maybe the wrong place, Jordan muttered. He wasn't sure which. The train rattled on, the lights overhead flickering slightly. Outside, the dark tunnels of the subway gave way to another station, the platform rushing past in a blur of concrete and tile. A few new passengers stepped in, oblivious to the weight of what had just happened. Jordan leaned back, feeling exhaustion seep into his bones. He had thought he was used to this city, used to its unwritten rules, the ones that dictated who got to move through it freely and who had to be careful. But now, sitting here, something felt different. Keanu shifted slightly, then turned to Jordan once more. You should keep that in mind, he said. Jordan frowned. Keep what in mind? Keanu's gaze was steady. That you matter. That your voice matters. Jordan wasn't sure how to respond to that. No one had ever told him that before, not in a way that felt real. He had always been taught to stay out of trouble, to keep his head down. But today, none of that had worked. The subway pulled into another stop. The doors slid open with a chime. Keanu stood, giving Jordan a final nod. Take care of yourself. And just like that, he stepped out onto the platform, vanishing into the sea of people, swallowed by the city. Jordan watched him go, his mind racing with thoughts he wasn't sure how to process. His fingers curled tighter around the strap of his backpack. Maybe, just maybe, he wouldn't stay quiet next time either. From that night forward, Jordan felt different. The fear, the powerlessness, those emotions still lingered, but now something new had taken root. A question, a thought that hadn't been there before. What if I could be the one to speak up next time? That night, he couldn't sleep. He replayed the moment in his head over and over again. The officer's grip, the murmurs of the crowd, Keanu's steady voice cutting through the tension. His pulse quickened as he relived it, the uncertainty, the anger, the relief. Lying in bed, staring at the cracks in his ceiling, he thought about what would have happened if Keanu hadn't been there. Would anyone else have stood up? Would he have been arrested, questioned, maybe worse? The thought chilled him. By the time morning came, Jordan had made a decision. He needed to understand why things like this kept happening. He needed to know how to fight back, not just for himself, but for others who might not have a Keanu Reeves to step in for them. Jordan started reading. He dug through articles about police stops, racial profiling, civil rights cases. He watched interviews with activists, listened to speeches from people who had spent their lives fighting injustice. He had never cared about politics before, never thought much about the bigger picture. But now, he couldn't look away. At school, he started paying more attention. He noticed the subtle ways authority figures treated different students. The way security guards seemed to watch some kids more than others. The way teachers assumed certain students were troublemakers before they even spoke. Had it always been this way? Had he just never noticed before? One afternoon, he found himself in the library, flipping through a biography of Malcolm X. He didn't mean to check it out. He had just picked it up to skim through. But as he read about Malcolm's younger years, about the moments that shaped him, Jordan felt something stir in his chest. He saw himself in those pages. And for the first time, he didn't just feel angry. He felt a purpose. By the time he graduated high school, Jordan had a plan. He wasn't just going to sit back and accept the way things were. He was going to do something about it. He applied to colleges, focusing on those with strong criminal justice programs. He started volunteering with local youth organizations, helping other kids understand their rights. When his friends got stopped by the police, he was the one who told them what to say, how to stand their ground. He wasn't just a kid who had been saved anymore. He was becoming the kind of person who could save others. Years later, standing in front of a lecture hall as a guest speaker at a university, Jordan told his story for the first time. He recounted that night in the subway, the fear, the anger, the moment Keanu Reeves stood up for him. He watched as the students leaned in, hanging on to every word. This isn't just my story, he told them. It's about all of us. It's about the choices we make when we see injustice. It's about deciding in that moment if we're going to be silent or if we're going to stand up. He looked around the room and saw something he hadn't expected, hope. And that's when he knew. He had become the person he once needed. Keanu never spoke about that night. Not in interviews, not in casual conversation, not even when friends brought up stories of everyday heroism. To him, it wasn't a moment that needed to be advertised. It was just something that had to be done, a simple choice to step up when someone else was being stepped on. But the people who had been there carried the story with them. It spread through word of mouth, through subway conversations, through quiet retellings in dimly lit cafes and bustling offices. Some people posted about it on social media, though Keanu never acknowledged the online buzz. He lived his life the way he always had, under the radar, away from the spotlight. Yet the impact of that one small act rippled outward. For Jordan, that moment stayed with him every single day. He thought about it on his walks to class, in the middle of the night when the world felt heavy, in conversations with friends who had similar experiences but never had a Keanu Reeves to stand up for them. He replayed it in his mind, wondering what would have happened if Keanu hadn't been there. Would anyone else have spoken up? Would he have been arrested? Charged with something he didn't do? Worse? He thought about how the world worked, how justice sometimes depended not on the truth, but on who had the courage to intervene. He realized that he wanted to be that person for someone else. That realization became a quiet flame inside him, one that would guide him in the years to come. One evening, Jordan found himself at a bookstore, wandering the aisles aimlessly. His fingers brushed over book spines, but his mind was elsewhere. He wasn't sure why he had come, only that he felt restless, like something inside him needed direction. Then he saw it, a book on civil rights movements. He pulled it off the shelf and flipped through the pages, stopping at a passage about protesters in the 1960s. They had put their bodies on the line, faced arrest, endured brutality, all because they believed in something greater than themselves. Jordan closed the book and exhaled. Maybe this was it. Maybe this was where he needed to start. Keanu, meanwhile, continued living his life as he always had. Filming movies, riding the subway, existing in that quiet space between celebrity and regular guy. The world knew him as a Hollywood star, but those who had been on that subway car knew him as something else. A man who didn't hesitate. A man who didn't need applause. A man who simply did the right thing and kept moving. That night had been just another night to him. But to Jordan, and to the countless others who heard the story, it was something more. It was proof that even in a city as vast and indifferent as New York, there were still people who would stand up for what was right. And that was a kind of heroism that didn't fade. People on that train told their friends, their families. Some wrote about it on social media, and while the story never went viral, it spread in quiet ripples. Strangers felt emboldened. Maybe they wouldn't be silent next time either. A young woman who had been sitting 2 seats away from Jordan found herself thinking about that night for weeks. She worked in a law firm downtown, mostly handling corporate cases, but something about what she had witnessed unsettled her. She had always believed in justice, but that moment, seeing how easily injustice could happen in broad daylight, planted a seed in her mind. She began volunteering at a legal aid organization on weekends, helping those who couldn't afford proper representation. A retired teacher who had been reading his newspaper on the subway started talking to his grandchildren about race, about standing up for others, about what it means to be a good person. He had seen many things in his long life, but he had never seen something quite like that moment, a Hollywood actor stepping in, not as a celebrity, but as a fellow human being. He wanted to make sure his grandkids understood that courage didn't come from being famous. It came from simply choosing to do the right thing. The subway driver, who had only caught the end of the confrontation from his mirror, made a quiet vow to himself. He had seen too many similar situations, some ending much worse. He promised that the next time something like that happened, he would step out of his cabin and speak up. His job might be to drive, but he realized that sometimes his role in life had to be bigger than that. Months later, in a high school classroom in Brooklyn, a teacher played a grainy cell phone video of the subway encounter. It had been uploaded anonymously, circulated in small circles. The video didn't have millions of views, but it had enough. The students watched, riveted, as Keanu's calm voice cut through the noise of the train. "Why do you think he did that?" the teacher asked after the clip ended. A student in the back raised his hand. "Because he could," he said simply. "Because he knew no one else would." Another student shook her head. I think it's because he believed it mattered. Like, maybe it wouldn't change the whole world, but it would change something for that kid. The teacher nodded. And what about you? Would you speak up? Silence. Then, slowly, one student nodded. Then another. A ripple. Meanwhile, Jordan carried the memory of that night with him everywhere. It didn't just live in his mind, it shaped his choices, his future. He had seen firsthand what it meant to be powerless, what it meant to be at the mercy of people with authority and assumptions. But he had also seen the power of a single voice. He had felt the weight of silence and learned how much it could be broken by just one person daring to stand up. One evening, he found himself at a bus stop, waiting for his ride home after a long day of studying. Across the street, he saw two security guards arguing with a teenager near a convenience store. The boy looked nervous, glancing around as if hoping someone might step in. The memory of the subway flooded back. Jordan squared his shoulders, inhaled deeply, and walked toward the scene. The ripple continued. Years later, Jordan found himself in law school. He wanted to fight injustice from the inside. He never forgot that moment. He carried it with him, reminder that one person speaking up could change everything. Law school was no easy feat. The long nights of studying, the heavy textbooks, the pressure of exams. It was all a challenge, but Jordan pushed through. He wasn't just doing this for himself. He was doing this for every kid who had ever been unfairly stopped, for every person who had felt powerless in front of authority. He wanted to make a real difference. One of his professors noticed his passion early on. "You're not just here to get a degree, are you?" She asked him one evening after class. Jordan shook his head. "I want to help people. I want to make sure what happened to me doesn't happen to others." The professor smiled. "Then you're in the right place." Jordan's experience on the subway became the foundation of his personal statement when applying for internships. It was more than just an application story. It was the reason he was there in the first place. Law firms specializing in civil rights cases took an interest in him, and soon he found himself working under some of the best attorneys in the field. The first time he stepped into a courtroom, his heart pounded in his chest. He wasn't arguing a case just yet. He was shadowing a lawyer in a racial discrimination suit. But as he sat there listening to the arguments, watching the way evidence was presented, something inside him clicked. This is where I'm supposed to be, he thought. He started working on pro bono cases, assisting lawyers in defending individuals who had been wrongfully accused or unfairly treated. Every time he helped build a defense, every time he saw a client walk free, it was another step forward, another victory against the kind of injustice he had nearly fallen victim to. But it wasn't just about the legal battles. Jordan also wanted to change minds. He began giving talks at schools, sharing his experience with students who looked like him, who had faced the same fears. "Know your rights," he told them, "but also know your power. One voice can make a difference. I know because someone used their voice to stand up for me." He visited community centers, spoke at public forums, and slowly, he started to see change, not just in the legal system, but in the people who listened to him. He received emails from young men who had been in similar situations, from teachers who had used his story to educate their students. One day, after finishing a guest lecture at a university, a student approached him. "I read about what happened to you," the young man said. "That story, it made me rethink a lot of things. I want to go into law now, too." Jordan felt a lump in his throat. Another ripple. Years later, Jordan became a public defender, then a civil rights attorney. He stood in courtrooms, argued cases, and fought for justice. And through it all, he carried that moment in the subway with him. One evening, while reviewing case files in his office, he got a call from an old friend. "Turn on the news," the voice on the other end said. Jordan did. And there, on the screen, was a clip of Keanu Reeves. Not on a movie set, not in an interview, but stepping in once again. This time, it was a different city, a different situation, but the same unwavering presence. Jordan smiled to himself. Keanu had kept moving forward, and so had he. Years had passed since that night on the subway, but for Jordan, it still felt like yesterday. The moment when Keanu Reeves had stood up for him had been more than just an act of kindness. It had been a turning point in his life. He had spent years working to make a difference, to be the voice for those who had none. And now, As he stepped onto the familiar subway platform, he found himself in a moment that felt eerily similar to the past. Jordan had just finished a long day in court, where he had defended a young man in a case of wrongful arrest. The echoes of his own experience had fueled his passion, making his fight personal. As he boarded the train, he noticed a commotion at the far end of the car. A group of teenagers, no older than he had been that night, were huddled together as a transit officer hovered over them. The officer was speaking in a stern voice, his posture rigid. "You can't be loitering here," he said. "Where are your tickets?" One of the boys, tall and thin, swallowed hard before answering. "We have them," he said, pulling out a crumpled strip of paper. The officer snatched it from his hand, glancing at it with suspicion. Jordan felt the tension in the air, a weight pressing down on the passengers nearby. Some looked away, others pulled out their phones. But no one spoke up, except one person. A familiar voice cut through the charged silence. "Is there a problem here?" Jordan turned, and his breath caught in his throat. Standing just a few feet away was Keanu Reeves. His presence hadn't changed, calm, steady, unwavering. He had aged, sure, but there was the same quiet strength in his eyes, the same certainty that had stopped injustice in its tracks years ago. The transit officer hesitated for a moment before straightening. "These kids were causing trouble," he said. "I need to make sure." Keanu shook his head. "They're just waiting for their train," he said simply. "You checked their tickets. They paid. There's no problem here." The officer shifted uncomfortably. The weight of attention in the subway car had turned against him. With a frustrated sigh, he handed the ticket back to the boy and stepped away. "Fine," he muttered. "Just don't linger too long." As the officer walked off, the boys let out a collective breath. One of them looked up at Keanu with wide eyes. "Hey, aren't you?" Keanu raised a finger to his lips and smiled. "Just a guy taking the subway." Jordan stepped forward, his heart pounding. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times, but now that it was here, he wasn't sure what to say. Keanu turned, noticing him for the first time. Their eyes met, and for a moment, recognition flickered across Keanu's face. Jordan cleared his throat. "Years ago, on a train just like this, you stood up for me." Keanu tilted his head slightly, searching his memory. Then slowly he nodded. "You're that kid." Jordan smiled. "Not a kid anymore. I'm a lawyer now." Keanu's expression warmed, a glimmer of pride in his eyes. "Good," he said. "The world needs more people willing to stand up." Jordan took a deep breath. "I just wanted to say thank you. What you did that night, it changed everything for me." Keanu chuckled lightly. "I just did what anyone should do." Jordan shook his head. "No, most people would have looked away. But you didn't." In that moment, it set something in motion. "I hope you know that." Keanu studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. "You did the real work, man." Jordan let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. They stood in silence as the train rumbled beneath them, the city moving past in a blur outside the windows. Finally, at the next stop, Keanu gave Jordan one last nod and stepped off the train, disappearing into the crowd just as he had all those years ago. And Jordan? He stayed, watching the doors close, feeling the weight of the moment settle into his chest. It was a full-circle moment, one he hadn't expected, but one that solidified everything he had worked for. Because sometimes, a single act of courage doesn't just change one life. It sets off ripples that reach far beyond what anyone could imagine. Jordan approached Keanu, thanking him for what he did years ago. Keanu just smiled and said, "You did the real work, man." And just like that, the moment passed, another ripple in the vast sea of human kindness.